Hello, and welcome to another Out of This World episode of Zilog and Moto. Well, no, not the game Out of This World, aka Another World. That's a totally separate video. I simply meant Out of This World in referencing the actual subject of today's video, who happens to be an extraterrestrial. Yay, get your groaning out of the way. Just remember, I'm the one that actually has to read these lines. To all returning viewers, welcome back, and to anyone who's new to the channel and is unfamiliar with what I'm trying to do here, well, what you see behind me is about 80% of my Sega collection, which currently is at 920 games, or actually 923 whenever the last 3 that I picked up eventually make it through customs. Those games consist of a variety of titles from the 8 and 16-bit libraries of the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. Which games? Well, I just mentioned customs because I'm trying to collect every English language game for those consoles, which involves a lot of titles from Europe that were not released in the United States. But I don't want to just collect a bunch of plastic and silicone and let it sit around collecting dust. I want to actually do in-depth reviews of each of these games, good and bad, and share that with all of you. For instance, curious about whether you should play Winter Olympic Games Lilyhammer 94 for the Genesis? Well, first off, you shouldn't, because it's atrocious. But I've got a video for that to tell you why, and hopefully eventually there will be about 1,300 of these videos to help you out with valuable information like that, or why there's no point in spending $1,000 on James Buster Douglas heavyweight boxing for the Master System when Heavyweight Champ exists. Today's game, though, isn't one that you can potentially save money on by buying a cheaper European copy because it was never released in Europe. Nor was it released in Japan, or even Brazil, which is kind of odd because Brazil loves their Master System games. No, today's game is one of only 3 games that was released exclusively for the Master System in the United States, along with Montezuma's Revenge and King's Quest, and that is Alf. And before anyone mentions Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, it got a Brazilian release. If you're not of a certain age, or not from the United States, or maybe you've never seen a certain picture of Eminem, you might be looking at Alf and going, Alf? What the hell is an Alf? Well, Alf was a TV show that ran for 4 seasons on NBC from 1986 to 1990, before hitting that magical 100 episode mark that gave it enough episodes to sell in a TV syndication package, and then be unceremoniously canceled, leaving fans hanging on a cliffhanger ending for 6 years until ABC stepped in and aired a made-for-TV movie called Project Alf that wrapped up the show's story, without any of the original cast members. Yeah, I don't really get it either, but apparently for a hit sitcom, the human cast of the show hated working on it and had no intention of coming back after production wrapped. Behind-the-scenes production drama issues aside, I always enjoyed Alf the TV show as a kid, so I'm really curious what Sega and Alf developer Nexa was able to come up with here, even though the game has apparently a bit of a reputation that unfortunately matches the television show's behind-the-scenes environment. I'm going to do my best to ignore that and dig into the game itself, but first, a look at the package.
And this is my copy of Alf. As mentioned in the intro, Alf was an exclusive release to the United States, which means that from a collector's perspective, if you're trying to obtain a copy of the game, you're somewhat limited in your options, as this isn't a game where you can import a potentially cheaper and more available PAL version. This is the issue I ran into when purchasing this, as I believe I had seen a copy of the game once at MGC a few years ago, but that year I'd already dropped a bunch of money on my Sega CD and a few other games, so I had to pass. Since then, though, I had never run across it again locally, so about a year ago I finally picked it up off of eBay, and it was not cheap. Since it was an eBay purchase, I was able to pick from a few different copies, and I think I ended up with one that was in good shape. The hang tab has been removed from the top of the case, but other than that, the rest of the case is fully intact with no scratches or tearing, and the inner cover looks fantastic, with no water damage, sun bleaching, or edge wear. As far as the front cover goes, I think this is an iconic cover. Now, some might disagree with me here, but I think there might be some bias there from those that either don't like the character of Alf or the game. But artistically, this is a fantastic design. It's simple, but it looks great, especially compared to earlier Master System releases. Oh, and I suppose if you had no idea who Alf was, well, there he is, front and literal center of the cover, with the space and stars in the background referencing his alien nature, and the Alf logo at the bottom coming straight from the television show and is seen in tons of merchandise from the era. Flipping over the back, and you can immediately tell that this is a US release instead of a PAL release, with all the flavor text being in English, and there is a lot of it. Thankfully, it's pretty well written, and I think it's pretty appealing for kids and fans of the show, with references directly to the show and Alf's girlfriend Rhonda and the Alien Task Force. And if you weren't aware, the "no problem" at the end was one of Alf's main catchphrases, much in the same way that Fonzie from Happy Days said, "Ay," or Mork from Mork and Mindy said, "Shazbot." So that was nice for them to work that in. The screenshots on the side are a little rough, which was to be expected for a mid-1989 release, but at very least there are 4 of them and they all show different areas in the game, for a nice variety. Opening up the case, and the manual and cartridge are in decent shape. Little bit of wear, but pretty good for 34 years old. As far as the manual goes, one of the first things I noticed was that it seemed a bit light, and the reason for that is because there's only about 12 pages here. I don't know why, but I was expecting a little bit more. The manual starts with a little intro on the inside cover, and then another full-page introduction that lays out the story behind the game. It seems a bit redundant. And then we've got this picture of Alf on the controls page. Yikes. Maybe we shouldn't draw Alf with only one color. Those eyes in particular are pretty disturbing. After that, the manual has a quick description of what you're supposed to be doing, and then has screenshots of some of the areas in the game. This is then followed up with a helpful section of the items that you have to collect, and that costume drawing. How could they not tell how creepy this stuff looked? Anyway, then you get a few hints and the high score table, pretty standard stuff. We'll be interested to see how much the manual actually helps and how much I still have to go to the internet for. And on that note, let's start playing some Alf. I talked a little bit about what Alf was in the intro, but if you're not familiar with the show or the character, Alf is short for Alien Life Form, and serves as the catchy nickname for a wild and crazy alien whose actual name is Gordon Shumway. Yes, Alf has a real name. Write that down somewhere in case you're ever out playing bar trivia and it comes up. As far as the show is concerned, Alf was flying around in his spaceship, but ended up crash landing and being adopted by the Tanner family, and then 4 years of wacky sitcom hijinks ensued, just with a puppet alien being part of the cast as a way to set it apart from other sitcoms. And it worked. Alf was wildly popular for a few years, before the real-life strains of working on the show burned out the cast members, and the novelty of Alf as a character wore off. 2 of the themes from the show were Alf trying to reunite with the other surviving members of his race from the planet Melmac, which had exploded after he left, and then also Alf running afoul of the Alien Task Force, whose goal is to capture Alf and perform experiments on him. Both of those tie into the plot of the game, which has 2 of Alf's Melmacian friends surviving the planet's explosion and instead going to Mars, leaving Alf with the task of attempting to repair his spaceship so that he can meet up with his friends, all the while trying to avoid being captured by the Alien Task Force. It's a pretty straightforward plot and about what you would expect from an 8-bit title from the era, while still attempting to tie into the show. And that's attempting in giant question marks because, honestly, there's not much here that has anything to do with the show, and the Tanners get as much screen time as they did in the TV movie, namely none, with the exception of Lucky the Cat. So you might be asking, just how does Alf, a 3-foot-tall furry alien, go about trying to repair a spaceship while avoiding the Alien Task Force? Well, in short, extremely painfully. You see, the Alfster is going to die again and again and again as you try to make your way off the planet. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Alf can be described as a multi-genre game, although you could just call it evil and be done with it. In the interest of thoroughness, though, it would be considered a hybrid of action and point-and-click adventure. That probably sounds somewhat bizarre, and it very much is. I can honestly say that I don't think I've ever played a game quite like it. Maybe it even would be better to describe it as an action RPG, say something in the vein of a completely deranged version of Legend of Zelda 2, complete with side-scrolling levels. Side note, the Nintendo fans will probably not be happy with that comparison, even in jest. However, I also don't care what they think. All joking aside, the game starts out with Alf standing outside the Tanner's house with a shot of their garage and your spaceship crashed into its roof, which was the original premise for the show, so I suppose that's a nice reference. The existence of the spaceship is a little confusing because even though the overall plot of the game is to fix it, you never really interact with it. It just kind of sits there until you collect the last item in the game, and then it's time to roll the ending. What you do need to interact with, though, is Alf's space scooter, which is sitting on the roof of Tanner's house. However, in classic point-and-click adventure game fashion, if you try to use the scooter at the beginning of the game, you'll just get a message from Alf complaining about how it's out of fuel, and that you have to find a way to fill it up before you go anywhere, and now you know what you'll be spending the next 80% of the game doing. With no other real direction, it's time to start exploring the Tanner's house, starting in the kitchen. On the counter is the Tanner's cat, Lucky, that I mentioned earlier, and if you include the spaceship and Rhonda and Skip, brings the references to the TV show to 3. Another side note, there was a constant gag about how the Melmacians ate cats as part of their normal diet, so referencing Lucky is slightly more important than you might think if you're not familiar with the show. Anyway, you do your best Martin Riggs impression, grab the cat, and then what? Well, if you stand around too long, the alien task force will creep around the house and grab you, so it's time to explore the house some more. At least, that's what I thought, the first 30 minutes or so that I was playing the game, as I had missed an important item in the kitchen, which is actually referenced in the hint section of the manual, so that's on me, sort of. As the house isn't terribly big, pretty quickly you'll find yourself in the basement, which somehow has an entrance to a large cave system. I really don't remember big cave exploring plot in the show, but maybe I missed that episode. Anyway, you now are in the game's first action sequence, with you having to avoid bats and rats as you explore the cave. However, if you're like me, you're just going to drive yourself crazy with timing patterns because you didn't get the one item you absolutely needed to get to make your way through the cave. Before I go any further, I guess I should say spoilers, because I am going to talk about what's needed and not needed to win the game, and you're seeing a complete playthrough in the video. Yes, the game is that short if you know what you're doing, possibly the shortest of any game I've played so far on the channel. Anyway, at this point, one of two things will happen. Either you'll get so frustrated with the bats that you'll put the game down and never pick it up again, which I'm sure happened with plenty of players back in the day, or you'll figure out that you need to not only grab Lucky from the kitchen, you need to grab a stick of salami from the fridge, as the salami is your weapon against the bats in the cave. Of course, I mean, what else would it be? Oh, and I suppose I forgot to mention, to get into the cave, you need to use Lucky to scare a rat away, and then jump up to turn on the light in the basement to even see the cave. So there is some low-level adventure puzzling going on. Anyway, now that with the salami in hand, you head back into the cave, and here's where the game just totally falls apart, which is impressive considering we're just about a minute or two into the game if you knew to grab the salami. The action sequences in the game are terrible. A salami works about as well as a weapon as you would expect, with hit detection being all over the place. It seems to work okay if the bats are either on the level with you or if they're coming up at you, but if they're flying down and you can't get out of the way, you're dead. Oh, and did I mention the one-hit kills? Yeah, those are a thing as well. If Alf touches an enemy, even in the slightest, he's dead. Assuming you can make it through the cave, you'll find a shed with a gold nugget in it, which you can then sell at one of the 2 shops in town. To get to the shops, you'll have to walk down the street, avoiding the alien task force goons and motorcyclists in the street. I'd call this the second action sequence, but you really aren't doing much other than just timely walking. Once you make it to the general store specifically, because both shops sell different things, you sell the gold nugget and buy a key that opens the closets in your house. Why don't you have a key to the doors in your own house? I don't know. Anyway, make your way back, raid the closets, and find a swimsuit. Also, there's a random monster that might come out of one of the closets. I have no idea what it's supposed to be, but it's easily avoided, so just move on. The manual says that it's polite to close doors after you use them, so maybe if you leave them open, the monster will roam around the house, making things more difficult for you, but that's just a guess. Now that you have the swimsuit, it's time for the next action sequence, which is diving in the lake behind the house. You have to dive to get two things: a pirate treasure, which just straight up gives you money, and a pearl that has to be sold to the shops, while avoiding catfish and harpooners while not running out of breath. This section can be frustrating as well, as the harpooners have a tendency to be able to shoot you from off the screen, but it's not as bad as the cave. Once you have the money and the pearl, it's back to town to sell the pearl and then buy a lantern and a ladder to further explore the cave. I should probably mention that the stores sell items that you don't necessarily need. For instance, they sell a fish, the horrific costume from the manual, and an ALF book. I don't mind the game being somewhat tricky, and adventure games having red herrings is pretty common, but the ALF book particularly is a disgrace. If you buy it and leave the shop, when you step outside, the game will display a few windows telling you the plot of the game, and then end the game. That's right, do not pass go, do not collect $200, just start over. Had the rest of the game been better, I'd probably find that maybe mildly amusing, but instead, I think this is what really pushes the game into set it on fire territory. Anyway, grab the ladder and the lantern from the shops, and go back to the cave. It's because this time you have to try to go twice as far to try to find another shed, and then you'll finally have found the fuel pellet for your space scooter. You remember that, the thing from the beginning of the game? Yeah. Head back outside to get onto the space scooter, and it's time to fly up into the clear blue yonder while avoiding 747s in another action sequence until you get to a space station, where you'll have to stop and buy a spacesuit before heading into the final action sequence, which is the same as the previous one, but now you're dodging spaceships and meteors. Eventually, you'll make it to the moon, where you finally find the part needed to fix your spaceship, and this cursed game is finally over. As far as the game's graphics go, well, I mean, you can see them. They're not good, especially for mid-1989. Oddly, the game seems reminiscent of Gangster Town, the light phaser title that I reviewed back in episode 140. And that's not a good thing, because even though I liked Gangster Town, it came out back in the first year of the Master System, 2 years previous to ALF, and looked very simple. The characters have the same odd outline style to them, with ALF and the Alien Task Force being the prime offenders, and then when ALF dies, a transparent ghost flies up to the top of the screen, the same as when you would shoot a gangster. Also, I could be wrong, but I think some of the same fonts were used in both games as well. Sega didn't list any credits for Gangster Town, so I would have no way of knowing if there was any developer crossover between the two, but the similarities seem a bit odd. Simply put, if I think your game looks like a simple light phaser game from 2 years before, and it's based on a huge television license, you screwed up. The sound is pretty unremarkable as well. You're going to hear the same few tracks the entire game, with one track for walking around the Tanner house in town, and then for each of the action sequences having different music. It's fine, but chances are you're going to get tired of it. With the music being just okay, you might think that they put in some nice sound effects. Maybe a rough speech sample of Alf saying no problem. Yeah, no. There's no sound effects whatsoever, making the mediocre music that much more present. I spent far too many hours playing the game this week, and to be perfectly honest, I did eventually put in an invincibility cheat to record the ending, because during one of my attempts, I literally lost my last life just as I was flying into the mouth of the moon to end the game, and I just didn't care anymore after that. The game controls just good enough to be frustrating, and honestly, if the hit detection was fixed, that would solve probably half the game's problems and move it into amusing kids game territory, which is what I think the original goal was, some sort of odd edutainment title, mixing action and critical thinking skills. At least, that's the only thing I can think that makes sense to me, because any other explanation amounts to me thinking the designers should never be allowed near a computer again. Just a quick story. When I was in 3rd grade, a few friends of mine started what we called the Atari Club. Basically, we would take a sheet of paper and design our own Atari 2600 games because we all had one at the time. Alf looks like a game that we would have designed in an Atari Club, and coincidentally, I was in 3rd grade in 1989 when Alf was released. In short, Alf is a game that looks like it was designed by 3rd graders, quite literally in my experience. I debated on whether to give the game 1 or 0 stars because the game is functional, and I try to reserve the total bombs for games that seem to be fundamentally broken, but the fact that it was released in mid-1989, combined with the fact that someone could legitimately speedrun it in 5 minutes, makes the decision easier. So, there you have it. Alf gets 0 stars from me, and is a total bomb. And game designers, don't taunt players with joke game-ending items when your game is already horrific. It's just mean.
And that was Alf for the Master System. Anytime I review one of these games that has a reputation, shall we say, I'm always hopeful. You know, maybe it's not quite so bad, maybe it just didn't appeal to a certain set of people, maybe it just got a bad reputation simply because it's a Sega title and not a Nintendo title, that sort of thing. And every now and then, I've gotten some real enjoyment from some of these otherwise bad games. Say, for instance, the first disc of Ground Zero Texas. Alf was unfortunately not one of those times. And it's really unfortunate that it's one of the 3 exclusive US Master System titles. Nintendo clearly did some bad things to take over the market, but with games like this, Sega wasn't exactly doing themselves any favors. Next time on Zilog and Moto, I'm actually somewhat afraid after this week. It's altogether possible that we're going to have 2 bombs in a row, something that thankfully hasn't happened before. I'll be reviewing what some might consider Sega's follow-up to Art Alive, and what seemed to be a direct response to Nintendo's Mario Paint after Art Alive looked so poor in comparison. Nice and timely too, releasing over 2 years after Mario Paint. Way to stay on top of things, Sega. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 191. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later!